Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A 6-year-old Muslim boy defeated an arrogant atheist professor in a debate with the logic of a glass of milk. The atheist professor initially laughed, believing he could embarrass Muslims, but the boy's clever answer left him speechless and embarrassed in front of hundreds of spectators. Let's watch this exciting debate. The event held in Reekin was filled with the voices of spectators from all over the city. Magnificent lights illuminated the main stage, where a professor stood confidently. He was Professor James Arnold, a renowned theoretician who had repeatedly won debates against religious leaders. With a neat black suit and a sharp gaze full of arrogance, he held the microphone tightly in his hand. His voice echoed throughout the room. "Who among you dares to say that God exists? I challenge anyone, and I guarantee that anyone who speaks will leave this stage convinced that God is just an illusion." The atmosphere suddenly became silent. Several Muslim scholars present looked at each other, but none dared to step forward. They understood very well how clever Professor Arnold was in turning every argument around with his intelligence and eloquence. Several people who had previously faced this professor had been badly defeated. Some even began to doubt their own beliefs. The tense silence made the smile on the professor's face grow wider. To him, this was proof that no believer could match his logic. Suddenly, I stepped forward with confidence. People around me started laughing and whispering, "What is this kid doing? This is not a playground for little kids. He doesn't know who he's facing." Professor Arnold raised his eyebrows, then chuckled in a mocking tone. "This is really interesting. You were all scared just now, and now a 5-year-old wants to challenge me?" The boy folded his arms and stared at Abraham sharply. "Understand, little one, you want me not to do it?" "It's me," the boy replied. "I've heard of it already." "Well, that kid, I know what he said. He's a prophet. That's what I said." "Akbo, this is Professor Arnold." He crossed his legs and smiled. "All right, Abraham, let's get started." At that moment, a stern voice echoed in the room. "Bah, there is God." The deep voice sounded tense. The little boy's gaze was sharp. Most people doubted something, but this time, there was an answer that could really shake things up. Professor Abraham sat quietly on the stage chair. His small feet did not touch the floor, but his eyes stared intently at Professor James Arnold. The hall that was once noisy suddenly became silent. Everyone was waiting for the continuation of this unexpected incident. A 5-year-old boy faces an atheist professor who is known as a genius thinker. Professor Arnold grins, leaning back in his chair with a relaxed expression. "So, Abraham, you say there is a God. Okay, prove it to me," he said in a mocking tone. He wanted to see how this little boy would struggle with his limited logic without fear. Abraham picked up the glass of milk that he had been holding carefully. He raised it to his chest and asked innocently, "Professor, is this milk available?" Professor Arnold raised an eyebrow. "Of course there is. I can see it clearly." Abraham nodded slowly. "Okay. Now, Professor, can you show me exactly where the milk is in the glass? Is it just at the top or just at the bottom?" Professor Arnold looked a little confused, but still replied, "No, the milk filled the entire glass. It was everywhere in it." Abraham smiled slightly. "That's God, Professor. He is everywhere, even though we can't see him directly." The room fell silent. The audience began to realize that the child's answer was not just childish innocence, but had a very deep meaning. Even some of those who had previously doubted the existence of God began to reconsider their beliefs. However, Professor Arnold did not give up. He chuckled, trying to hide the anxiety that was starting to arise within him. "Okay, it was just a game," said the boy. "Now I'm the one asking, if God exists, why can't we see him? I only believe in something real." Abraham was silent for a moment, then raised his glass of milk. In a soft but firm voice, he asked, "Professor, do you have any sense?" Professor Arnold snorted. "Of course I do. I'm a professor, young man. I have a very sharp mind." Abraham smiled and said, "That's me." "I'm Abraham." Whispers of admiration were heard among the audience. They began to understand the depth of the child's thoughts. Seeing that this little boy was not talking nonsense, salon, but using simple yet sharp logic to answer difficult questions, Professor Arnold realized that the situation was beginning to change. He, who usually easily defeated his opponents, now felt like he was facing something different. This 5-year-old boy, with his innocence, has made the truth always have a place in the hearts of those who seek light. Now the battle of ideas between a little boy and an atheist professor truly begins. Professor James Arnold tried to remain calm, but a fine sweat began to form on his forehead. He had not expected a 5-year-old child to be able to answer his questions so sharply. However, as a renowned academic, he did not want to lose in front of the hundreds of people watching this debate. With his absolute power, why didn't he prevent all that? For a moment, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. One of the classic arguments often used by atheists to challenge the existence of God is about evil and suffering in the world. Many religious people have difficulty answering this question because evil and suffering are real in the world. Abraham was silent for a moment. He looked down at his glass of milk, then looked at the professor with clear, innocent eyes. In a gentle voice, he asked, "Professor, if I add a little salt to this milk, will it be the milk that becomes salty or me?" Professor Arnold frowned, then replied, "Of course you made it salty." Abraham smiled and said, "Professor, God created this world like this milk. However, it is humans who often add evil to it." The room was noisy again. People started whispering, contemplating the boy's answer that contained deep meaning. Professor Arnold bit his lip. He felt that was enough of an answer, but he still asked, "But Abraham, if God really exists, shouldn't he be able to make this world?" Without evil, true goodness would not exist. Abraham looked at the professor, then asked in a low voice, "Professor, were you forced to do something you didn't want to do?" Professor Arnold frowned. "Of course not. I have the freedom to choose what I want." Abraham smiled. "God gave man the freedom to choose. If God forced man to always do good, then man would no longer have free will. Without free will, true goodness would never exist." The atmosphere grew quieter. Some people seemed to nod, understanding that the child's words made sense. However, Professor Arnold was still trying to find a loophole in the argument. "Abraham, does that mean God wills there to be suffering?" he asked. Abraham looked at him calmly. With God, after going through hardships, some people become stronger after facing trials. Like a doctor who wants to cure his patient, God wants people to become better. A man in the front row suddenly lowered his face, looking moved. He had lost his family in a disaster, and all this time, he blamed God. But Abraham's answer made him think again. Professor Arnold began to be at a loss for words in the debate. Usually, he was able to silence his interlocutors, but now his usual arguments were turning against him. He knew that this kid was not talking carelessly. Every answer had a deep meaning. However, Professor Arnold still refused to give up. In a softer voice, he said, "But why does God let little children like you suffer? Why are there children who are hungry, sick, and abandoned?" Abraham looked at him with a gentle smile. "Professor, is the mother holding her crying baby a bad mother?" Professor Arnold interjected, "Of course not." "That's the mother. She loves her child." Abraham nodded. "Sometimes a baby has to wait a while before getting the milk it needs, but that doesn't mean the mother doesn't care." Professor Arnold began to understand where this conversation was headed. Abraham took a breath, then said in a soft voice, "It's the same with God, Professor. Sometimes we suffer, sometimes we don't get what we want right away, but God is always there, like a mother who keeps holding her baby. We just need to trust that He knows what's best for us." The atmosphere in the hall was so quiet that the audience's breathing could be heard. Some people were seen wiping away their tears. They did not expect that such a simple answer, coming from the mouth of a 5-year-old child, could be so touching. Professor Arnold lowered his head. He could not find any loopholes in Abraham's answer. For the first time in his life, he felt defeated in a debate. But more than that, he felt in line with something he had been hiding, his own judgment. Abraham had revealed something that had been hidden in his heart. Now all eyes are on Professor Arnold. What would he do next? Professor James Arnold sat with his body slightly bent. For the first time in his life, he was at a loss for words. For years, he was used to destroying his opponent's arguments with his sharp logic and intelligence. But tonight, his difference was not with a scientist or a religious scholar, but a 5-year-old boy who sat quietly in front of him, holding a glass of milk, which was now only half left. The audience, who filled the hall, were still holding their breath, waiting. How would the professor reply to Abraham's answer? But before he could speak, Ali immediately spoke. Professor Arnold was silent. His face, which was usually full of confidence, now looked a little shaky. With a calmer voice, he finally asked, "Abraham, you said that God is always there, that he always takes care of humans like a mother holding her baby. But if that is so, why do so many people lose hope? Why do some people pray for years and still not get answers?" Abraham looked at the professor with his clear eyes that had lost their light. Holding his glass of milk, he asked in a gentle tone, "Professor, if I put this glass in a completely dark room, will the milk still be there?" Professor Arnold frowned. Of course, darkness doesn't eliminate the milk's presence. Abraham thought for a moment, then said softly, "It's the same with God. When someone feels like their life is filled with darkness and they don't have any answers, it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. God is still there, like the light." Some in the audience began to sob. The answer touched many hearts, especially those who felt alone in their life's difficulties. Professor Arnold tried to organize his thoughts. He tried to find a loophole in Abraham's answer, but Abraham only smiled faintly and said, "Professor, have you ever seen a small child who asks his parents for something but is not immediately given to him?" Professor Arnold nodded. "Of course, that's a normal thing." Abraham then asked again, "Does that mean the child's parents don't care?" Professor Arnold was silent for a moment, then shook his head. Sometimes they just wait for the right time to give it." Abraham smiled. "So it is with God, Professor. We might, as much as we can, end up filled with skepticism, but now we begin to be filled with silence, full of contemplation." Professor Arnold took a long breath. There was something stirring in his heart. He did not expect a child could make him rethink all the beliefs he had held so far. Firmly but still unwilling to give up, he asked in a more careful tone, "Abraham, I still do not understand one thing. If God really exists, why does he let good people suffer? Why do honest and loving people often get hard trials?" Abraham looked down for a moment, then looked at the professor with a look that was very sharp for a child his age. "Professor, have you ever seen a teacher test his own child?" asked Abraham. The teacher continued his exam, and Professor Arnold fell silent. His patience was being tested. The students in attendance were watching intently. "Abraham, Lord?" Professor Arnold paused. "The professor is punished for his patience, and those who pass the test will be stronger, wiser, but also more confused." The boy looked at him quietly. "Religion is just empty dogma. God is just an illusion," said Professor Arnold. But the words of a 5-year-old shook his own beliefs. He was silent for a long time, even longer than before. The audience waited tensely, wondering if the professor would continue this debate or finally admit defeat. Meanwhile, Abraham sat quietly. He showed no signs of wanting to win or lose. For him, the most important thing was to find the truth. Finally, Professor Arnold lowered his head. With a slightly trembling voice, he said, "Burke, I don't have an answer." The room became noisy. An atheist professor, who had been so adamant in opposing religion, finally admitted defeat. However, Abraham did not show a triumphant expression. He only smiled gently and said, "Professor, sometimes it is not the answer that we need, but a heart that wants to see the truth." Professor Arnold stared at the boy with confused eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was at a crossroads. The beliefs he had held so tightly were beginning to feel fragile. The debate was far from over, but one thing was for sure. A 5-year-old had shaken the world of a professor who thought himself invincible. The room remained silent. None of the hundreds of attendees dared to speak. All eyes were on Professor James Arnold. Professor Arnold was now sitting silently with an expression that was hard to read, while Abraham remained calm, as if he was not a child who had just made a professor silent. A strange feeling rumbled in Professor Arnold's chest. I, who had been so certain of God's absence, now began to feel something I had never felt before: doubt about the end of everything. Abraham looked at Professor Arnold. "Have you ever seen an artist paint?" Professor Arnold frowned, but still answered, "Sure." Abraham smiled. "When an artist begins to paint, is the painting perfect right away? Or is it just a few seemingly meaningless strokes at first?" Professor Arnold began to understand where this conversation was headed. "It started out as just a scribble," Abraham continued, "but this world is God's canvas, and humans are the scribbles that slowly form meaning." The woman in the middle row sobbed. She was a widow who had lost her husband in the war, and she had always wondered, why is the world so cruel? However, the boy's words calmed her heart. Professor Arnold fell silent again. He realized that every answer Abraham gave was not only reasonable, but also contained wisdom far beyond his years. Still, he did not give up completely. In a softer voice, he asked, "If God is painting the world, why doesn't he finish it right away? Why must there be such prolonged suffering?" Abraham smiled slightly. "Professor, have you ever read an interesting book?" Professor Arnold nodded. "Sure, there are many interesting books." Abraham looked at him innocently. "If a book is very interesting, do you want to read it quickly to finish it? Or do you want to enjoy it slowly until the last page?" Professor Arnold. Abraham, God exists, and nothing is in vain in this life. Some in the audience began to hang their heads, reflecting on how often they complain about life without realizing that every event is part of a bigger story that God is writing. Professor Arnold rubbed his face. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to deny that there was something greater than human logic. He looked at Abraham and asked in a trembling voice, "Abraham, am I included too?" Abraham smiled. "That's life, Professor." Professor Arnold no longer felt certain about his atheism. Something inside him began to crack, making room for the light he had so vehemently rejected. In the midst of this deep reflection, a 5-year-old boy managed to shake the faith of an atheist professor who had previously felt unshakable.